This is like the first time I've done public speaking since I was in grade school, so if you can't hear me, just, stick like a finger up so I know you can't hear me. Yeah, for that, yeah. All right. So, making the most of your cross-site scripting opportunities. Now, do I have any web developers in the room? People with web development experience? Yeah, we got a few. Okay. You might be bored. I don't know. What I'm going to cover is a lot of sort of elementary JavaScript stuff you can use to do some cool things, but you probably already know how to do a lot of it. Okay, so quick bit about me. I'm just going to pop all those up. So, yeah, I'm a senior security consultant at Secure Ideas, which is based in Jacksonville, although I'm actually based in Rock Hill, South Carolina. I'm a sort of a long-time software developer. Professionally, about 10 years. And then before that, upwards of 10 years as sort of a hobbyist as well. And most of that was web app development. So I've always been sort of a security enthusiast. Found a few security flaws out in the wild. One of my sort of favorites was, everybody knows Gawker, probably. So not their current platform, an older platform. I discovered at one point they had a bunch of admin controls for comments that were just hidden with CSS. There was some back-end protection on most of those buttons, but one of them, the delete comment button, did not have back-end protection. So kind of quietly reported that one and went away, but that was before I was actually doing it intentionally. I just kind of picked through the site and there it was. And that was really early in my web developer career, and so I kind of took off from there. Security as my main job function is a really recent move for me, actually. I've only been doing it since kind of earlier this year. If you want to look me up on GitHub, I've got my account mgillam, and also my Twitter. So if you just want to take out your phone really quick, launch Twitter, tweet about how awesome this talk is and how all the people drinking beer right now are missing out. All right. So just a quick, why not just do an alert one? Why? You're in the middle of a pen test. That proves execution. You can move on to some better findings. You could do that. But sometimes the client's just not going to get it because even developers I've worked with, people that have been doing apps for 15 years, they see I show them a cross-site scripting flaw and they go, so what? What can you do with that? Sometimes it's within scope to exploit that in order to proceed further with the test, maybe to capture credentials, for example. So it's good to have the tools to do that. And so I'm going to show you a couple of JavaScript tricks that you can probably use if you want to develop some more advanced payloads. All right. So here's what I'm going to go through. A little bit of DOM traversal. It's elementary if you've been doing a lot of web stuff, but it's sort of critical, and it's more critical now with stuff like Angular and React, Ember, where you've got binding with templates because they don't have IDs as much. So you can't necessarily easily get a handle on the element you want. Sometimes you need to get the nearest element you can and then kind of traverse the DOM to get the one that you really want. Stealing HTML forms. My example here is going to be actually just you find the form, get a handle on it, add an onSubmit function that gives you a copy of the contents of the form first, and then submits it to their server. Basic rewriting the DOM. Fetching hosted resources. You got a JavaScript file or an HTML file that you want to use in your exploit that you're hosting on your own server that you control. Just generally how to pull it in and use it. Introducing malicious objects. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on that one, and that's basically without breaking their program, getting your malicious code into the sort of logical flow of it. Probably, I'm thinking we'll have more time than we need, so if you have questions as we go, just stick not a finger but a whole hand up. And we'll try to address those as we go. So a lot of this is going to build on top of itself. If you got questions or I haven't explained something well, which is why you would have questions, then let's get it out of the way right away. I quickly want to mention jQuery because it's almost everywhere, but I'm not going to use it in my examples. It's not because you shouldn't use it. If it's there, by all means, take advantage of it. But I don't want you to be dependent on it. So my examples don't use it. Certainly feel free to use it in the wild, though. Oh, hey, here's another one. Eavesdropping on asynchronous communication. This is actually extending that idea of introducing malicious objects, but it'll be actually an example that involves listening in on all basically the AJAX activity so that you can get a copy of, first of all, the payload they're sending, second of all, their response without breaking their application again. All right, so DOM traversal. It's easy when you have an ID attribute, like, where's my ID attribute? My ID attribute. Yeah. Okay, some of these could have an ID attribute. Wow, that was a big oversight. And so if you got one, it should be unique, it should be on one element, and you can do document.getElement by ID, grab that element, do whatever you want with it. That's great if it's there. If it's not there, you got to get more creative. You got to get what you can get and then traverse from there. So you get a lot of options for getting a handle. Get element by ID, if there is an element that isn't the one you want but is near it, is often your preferred option, because again, you get one element, you get the specific element. It implies that it's not going to be some dynamic thing where you're working through a list of items and you want a specific one. You could get elements by name, which is the name property. Mostly you'll see that on forums. A lot of the time there'll only be one with that name anyway, but not always. That returns an array. Get elements by tag name. It's actually the name of the tag, so if it's div, it's a div. If it's a paragraph, it'll be a P. Those tend to be sequential in the order they appear in the markup. You can't necessarily always count on that, but they tend to be. By class name, that's CSS classes. You'll see a lot of those. And query selector, I'm not going to dig into that too much, first of all, because I would actually need to pull the reference material on that to write the selector in the first place. Second of all, I think it's just a little bit much this late in the day. But that will let you do some of the sort of flexible things that you could do with jQuery as well fairly easily, like when an attribute has a certain value, that tag matches your selector. All right, DOM traversal. So what I've done, is that too green? Can people actually read that? Yeah, okay. What I've done, I've sort of laid it out like a family tree here. So if I got, that's you. So that's the element you can get. That one's got the ID. And you want to get to your cousin over here. Basically, you got a concept of kind of one parent to an element, and as many children as you want, and siblings. Everybody else is a sibling to it. So you'd sort of be moving up a level to the parent. Oh, so I don't have to jump? Is it the button in the middle?
Top button, and you just probably point it wherever you want to go.
Yeah. All right. Nice. Right. So I go from, I do get element by ID U, so I get this one. Dot parent node to move up, and then the ant is the sibling of the parent, and then one of the children of the ant is the cousin, and that's pretty much all there is to it. It's up and around. I'm going to see, this is going to be interesting, I'm going to see if I can pull a code example that I have. That it? That's it. Can you see that? You can't see that, can you? Wow. That's not even on the right screen. That's way small. Okay. Let's give it a quick try anyway. We'll keep that in mind. No, that's blurry. All right. I'll shove that out of the way. So it would look like document.getElementById. Yeah, kind of covered it. Document.getElementById. One thing you need to check with those is there's often a difference between like getting a sibling, for example, and an element sibling is what the actual method is. So the two different things, there's slightly different implications. And the one you want is the element one, usually, because the other one will get you text nodes as well, which you probably don't want to act on. So that's just rudimentarily, you're moving up and down the tree. If you're moving up one level. If you're moving down, you're moving into one of the many children. When you interact with children, you're dealing with an array rather than a single element. Stealing HTML forms. There are a few ways to do it. You do some gymnastics with cross-domain posting and redirecting. I don't like that approach. I think it's more difficult and more prone to failure. But if you hold the event on an on-submit event, then you can run an asynchronous post, like an AJAX call, to your own server to pass everything you want to there, and then let it submit normally, or resubmit it as the case may be. I'm trying to think how my examples are going to work here, and I'm not sure they're big enough to fit on this screen. We might end up having to pull people in and kind of go over it. I'm also going to throw it up on GitHub after as well. But let's give it a try. Let's give it one more quick try. Let's see if we can make that any bigger. I don't know. I got zooming. Ah, hey, there we go. That's better. It's a little awkward from here. So we could actually do that DOM traversal really quick. There we go. There's us. There's our cousin that we want to get to. This is exactly the same as the one that was in the slide. All right. Now, if I can get to my... It's hard to tell where my console is right now. Move that over so I can get in there. All right, so is that too low? You see that? There. So if I call that, it returns that element by ID just like you'd expect. Simple, you can chain it together. Parent node moves you up. Element sibling. Is that wrong? That's wrong. I think siblings is going to get us a text node. Oh, it's next sibling. That's what it is. That's what I want. There we go. And you can do first child. Our first element child, but I'm going to do children. There we go. And we got to our cousin, just sort of by chaining together those moves. So, going back to where we'd sort of moved on to, try this again. Yeah. And by the way, I like to do this. I like to sort of work it out in the browser when I can. So I've just changed it on an exec payload button because I figured, hey, I'm doing a presentation. It's probably going to go wrong. So I wrote it in advance, stuck it on a button. But there's my actual script. Again, probably easier to look at it on GitHub after the fact, but let's see if I can expand that out so we can see it. Or pull it up in a code editor. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. There we go. So that's functions there to sort of simulate the payload executing. Where we go? Just got a logging message there to say that it's armed. You probably don't want to do that if you're actually trying to use it for an exploit. And then I accessed the form element itself. In this case, I gave it an ID to make it easy. Tag into the onSubmit event handler and give it this function that I created here. So it's a little bit weird. This function gets called right away when I'm assigning the event handler and returns this function, which is what will actually be the event handler. Kind of cover how that works a little bit more later, but so I pass this false in, this Z is the false, which is what I use to tell whether it's been called before so that I can do what I'm going to do. So I'm grabbing the elements by the tag name here. In this case, I just log them out to the console. Again, you probably want to throw them off onto your server or wherever you want to, if you're capturing credentials. In this case, that's all I'm doing. And then if Z is false, which means it's the first time through, I set it to true, run a set timeout. In this case, I made it a little bit more pronounced. I set it to 3,000 milliseconds. That's sort of to simulate the delay you would have if you passed it off asynchronously. Then I return a false, which will actually keep the form, because I'm returning this, it'll keep the form from submitting. Then, inside this timeout, when it actually happens, I call a submit on the form. I get the form again and call a submit. It'll pass through. Z will be true. It'll return true and it'll get submitted normally. Now, if I shorten up that delay to something, you sort of need to kind of take a guess at what your latency is, but if I make that 600 milliseconds, that's going to be fine. It'll be less pronounced, and it'll work. It'll pass those form values to me first, and then the form will get submitted normally. The user won't even know that anything is wrong, and I'll have a copy of the credentials that were on that form. How are we doing so far? Good? All right. Losing my cursor. Oh, I'm looking at two different screens that are mirroring the exact same thing, looking for it. There we go. So, sort of explains exactly what I was just talking about. So I hold the on submit event while I wait for the asynchronous post to happen. And then execute it. Changing the DOM. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Most of the time you're going to get a hold of your element, you're going to do a .inner HTML and throw in the markup that you want. Usually that's going to be the easiest way to do it. It's also a good thing to look for if you're looking for a cross-site scripting vulnerability, by the way. Because it tends to be taking a value and throwing it in someplace that it will render. The other one that you might want to do, if you want to hide an element and show it again later, is just style.display none. CSS hides it, takes it out of the flow, and you can re-render it later when you need to by doing a display. You can actually pass it an empty string, and it'll show up again usually. you might have to do inline depending on what you're changing, if it has a display property set already. That can be useful if you're doing something like hiding a form, showing something that's saying, hey, you timed out, you need to log in again, and then showing that form again when they do. We'll get to that in a second. The other thing this sort of thing is good for, changing the DOM, place where I've found it valuable before, is you find a vulnerability, but it's not on the page that you want it on. You find it on the registration page. Okay, to use that effectively in like a social engineering attack, you got to get somebody who, you got to get somebody to register, which is a little bit silly. Or you got to somehow convince an existing user that they need to register again. Neither of those are really practical. You would like it to be a login page, so make it a login page on their domain and then direct them there. And I think I've got another quick example for that. So, this is just sort of a normal login page, very simple one that I threw together. Sort of my reference implementation of the login page, and I'll show you the rendered version in a second. And my registration page follows the same kind of design concepts. If it's on the same site, it usually does. In fact, a lot of people use something like a master page from .NET or use a partial template to include the exact same JavaScript resources. So even if they're not using them, you'll often have all the same JavaScript resources on every page. Yeah. Huh. So there's the registration page. In this case, again, I took a shortcut figuring it's a presentation, things are going to definitely go wrong. And I created a variable already on the page that has the markup from the login page. Normally I would just go to the login page and grab a copy of that. But in this case, I've put a div at the top level. I'm going to use that as my handle. There we go. I know I've got a handle on my div. In fact, that's a collection. But I want the individual element. There's my template. Now let's see if it worked. Ta-da! And it's great. It's already on the domain that the registration page was on. It's even less likely to look out of place. Probably using the same valid SSL certificate, and if you point the form action at the same place, they'll actually log in successfully, but you can rig it up so that you can capture credentials with it at the same time. Yeah, okay. What about fetching HTML for another host? Yeah, and I hope I have a working example of that. I think I do. But that's absolutely a possibility. You can set it up on a different host if you can't pass in the whole payload, it's always nice if you can just kind of edit it in line through the vulnerability that you already have. But if you can't do that, then it's always a positive thing if you can you can fetch it from someplace else. You can write a minimal payload to go and get it and just shove it in where you want it anyway. I think probably we'll do the JavaScript version of that first. Is that a little small? That's a little small. Let's zoom in a little. So this has a little bit of sort of extra going on that's not entirely necessary, but the idea is still there. XML HTTP request. Everybody know what that is? Okay. Anybody not know what that is? People use that for Ajax. This is the object, the native object that underpins everybody's Ajax implementation. Doesn't matter. jQuery is backed by this. You get the mini jQuery version in Angular is backed by this. Whatever implementation you're using with React is backed by the same thing. If you've got an easier one to use, like the jQuery one is available and more concise, definitely use it. In this case, I didn't, but I'm just, here I got my URL, I'm fetching it. When it comes back, I throw it into an eval, just plain old JavaScript eval, and it'll execute the script file. It's the same reason why you don't want to see evals on the client site. Well, maybe you, as the pen tester, maybe you do. It depends. It's always sort of difficult to reconcile wanting to find things with wanting the client to be secure. But it's a bad thing to see normally, because it's the sort of thing where if you can get something into it, you can get script to execute. In this case, we're using it for exactly that purpose. And the same thing, essentially, can be done for HTML from another source. The only thing is, instead of using eval in here, I would do document.innerHTML, or whatever the object is, the DOM object, the element is, .innerHTML, and shove the response text into that instead. It could reference style sheets that are available on that page. It could reference other JavaScript that's available on that page. You just shove it in there, and it'll get rendered, which can be a really effective delivery mechanism if you've got a big payload, a big chunk of HTML, and you can't stick it in through your initial attack vector. Okay. Now this gets a little bit scripty, so we've got to kind of build it up a little bit at a time. Try to bear with me. So injecting malicious objects into the flow. It's hard to not make it sound complicated, but it's not complicated, really. So it's going to go through some really basic stuff, but we'll build up to some advanced stuff within like 3 or 4 slides. Don't worry. We got a function. We got an add function. It takes 2 parameters, A and B, adds them together and returns that value. Right? It's next to Hello World, it's one of the most basic examples of anything ever. The next one down is almost identical. Has a variable add, receives a function, assigns it to that variable. You call it exactly the same way afterward. It's just taking an anonymous function and assigning a reference to it in the form of a variable. The thing that would be different there is that I could assign something else to add. I could do it in either case, actually. But I can assign something else to add, a different function, and that function would get called instead from all the functions that already reference it by name. That's just sort of an artifact of it being an interpreted language, really. So let's modify it a little bit. Here I have a function that returns a function that does the adding thing. It's my add factory function. It's anybody who's worked around Java has certainly seen the factory method before. It's sometimes an overused design pattern. In this case, this is just sort of a step on the way to where we're going for us. But so it's a function returning a function, and I'm assigning a variable, assigning that a reference to that function to this variable add1. I could call add1, and it would be calling that function essentially, that returned one, which is the same add1 that we saw before, but it would be called add1. Okay. Here I made it more generic. So we've got this math factory. Same idea, function returning a function, but in this case, I'm passing in a value and treating that value as a function. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually do this if you want to write an add and subtract function, but it illustrates the example well, I think. I pass in the logic as a parameter in the form of a function, and then I use it. And this function, this inner one that I'm returning, which is what it's going to get assigned to add or subtract respectively, maintains a reference to this value, even though this has essentially gone out of scope. And there's a reason that we're doing this, and we're right about to get there. I don't know why I did this. Yeah. So the main thing to look at that's changed here that I've done is I've wrapped it in a set of brackets. This is that same thing that looked weird before with that false that was passed in. I've wrapped a set of brackets around my function, and then another set of brackets afterward that have the parameter. And when you see this is JavaScript closure syntax. This outer function will be immediately invoked, and this will be returned right away and assigned to the variable. And for the practical purposes of what we're about to do, that's really good. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to modify this. Fetch stuff from the server. Say that's an existing function on your client site. This is what we're going to hijack on them. So what do? We reassign the reference to it so that anything that's calling it calls our function instead. But we still need the original function so that it can work normally, so they don't detect that there's anything wrong with the page. So when we create it, we pass it in there so that we have the only reference to it, and everything that anywhere that they are referencing it is now repointed to our function. In this case, all I've done is log the payload when it comes in, and then I call their function normally anyway. And again, even though I used log in this case, I could do this as an asynchronous post off to my site to grab values. And then probably in the callback, or promise, if you're using promises, call the normal function, let it proceed as it normally does. But what I'm missing at this stage is what response they're actually getting from the server, which I might be interested in. So that's where we're going to go next. And that's what right here, I've created an evil success function, a callback, that grabs the response and then calls their success callback with that same response passed to it. Same thing for the fail. This would be, of course, inside of that previous one, right where this ... is. So that when theirs is called, when the original function is called, we use those callbacks, my evil ones. Theirs still get called normally, but we grab a copy of their responses first. And that is really pretty much it for stealing Ajax, which if you're using it for intelligence rather than credential capture, or if they're using Ajax to do authentication, it's a really good thing to steal. Maybe you can steal sensitive information that way because you're on a page that's using Ajax to do with the infinite scroll thing. And you just want to grab records as they scroll. Hey, there's more. I didn't know there was more. And yeah, okay, so this is, if instead of, this is just a made-up function, but this is an example. I'm using an asynchronous function, and daisy chaining in the on response rather than kind of doing it inline like I was. Fundamentals of it aren't really very different. It just means that you're calling their function in like a callback or a promise rather than calling it inline in a synchronous call. And that's like, well, I started early. I started 2 minutes early, so we're almost at 40 minutes. A couple of useful resources. If you've been doing anything on the web, you probably already know about them, but I'm going to point them out anyway. MDN, you want to figure out how any kind of objects in JavaScript work. That's W3 Schools is worth a mention. It used to be my first stop. Now MDN is my preferred result. Either one of those, though, they've got a listing of all the methods that are there. Look at document, for example. We were doing a lot of things that were document.getElement by ID. You don't know how something works, look at document itself. Or look up element and find the generic stuff that every element has, because that sort of stuff is useful for interacting with it. But really, once you got JavaScript execution, your imagination is sort of the biggest limit. You can do a lot more than just pop up an alert box. You can kind of do whatever you want as long as it's client side, and maybe a few things server side as well. Anybody, any questions? Yes?
Maybe I missed this because I walked in a little bit late, but how do you get that code onto the server or
any sort of cross-site scripting vulnerability, and it's hard to do a generic kind of thing to use every time because everyone is different. So a lot of those, I showed you a couple of ways to pull it in through your own AJAX call and use it that way. You might be able to use that to also use a payload that obeys the filter. I didn't cover getting the actual execution. Didn't think I'd have time. I guess I did. But one really good reference, if you know OWASP, there's a good filter evasion sheet there. Usually the best telltale, the easiest telltale that you've probably got something, if you throw a regular double quote into a field and it gets reflected and escapes the field, then you've got something probably that you can work with. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yes?
How would you bypass Chrome and Microsoft Edge's like their XSS filter?
Again, it's sort of a case-by-case scenario. I haven't really had to do a lot of it, and I've done testing in Chrome. I think part of it is just that those filters don't seem to be all that effective if the site is vulnerable. But I can't say that I've tested it in enough depth to really know what the limits are there. Anything else? All right. Beers, right?